The studio smelled like old wood and cigarette smoke. The lights were low. The carpet absorbed every footstep, every breath, every silence that hung too long in the air. It was late September, and the four of them sat in different corners of the same room, pretending they were still together. John Lennon leaned against the wall near the mixing board, arms crossed, staring at nothing. Paul McCartney sat at the piano, fingers resting on keys he wasn't playing. George Harrison stood by the window, looking out at the London street below, watching cars pass in the dark. Ringo Starr sat behind his drums, sticks in his lap, waiting for something that wasn't coming. No one was talking. They had been the biggest thing in the world. Screaming girls, sold-out stadiums, songs that made people cry and dance and feel alive. They had changed music. They had changed culture. They had been brothers, or something close to it. But that was before the money arguments, before the creative fights, before Yoko, before Linda, before the lawyers and the contracts and the cold business meetings where no one smiled anymore. Now they were just four men in a room, and the room felt too small. Paul had called the session. He wanted to finish the album. He believed they could still do it. Still make something great if they just tried. He believed in the band the way some people believe in religion, with a kind of desperate faith that refuses to see what's breaking right in front of it. John didn't believe anymore. He had stopped believing months ago, maybe longer. He was tired of pretending, tired of being told what to do, tired of being part of something that felt like a cage. He loved Paul once, the way you love a brother. But love can turn into something else when you're forced to stay too close for too long. When every idea becomes a fight. When every song becomes a war. George cleared his throat. Are we starting or not? Paul turned on the bench. Yeah, let's start. His voice was soft, careful, like he was talking to someone who might run. John didn't move. Ringo tapped his sticks together, a quiet rhythm, something to fill the silence. He was the peacemaker, always had been, the one who tried to hold it together when the others were tearing it apart. But even Ringo looked tired now. His eyes were dim, his shoulders slumped. Paul played a few chords, a melody they'd been working on for weeks. It was good. It was beautiful even, but beauty wasn't enough anymore. John, Paul said. You want to try the harmony on the bridge? John stared at him. No. Paul's fingers stopped moving. What do you mean, no? I mean, no. I don't want to do it. The room went cold. George turned from the window. Ringo stopped tapping. Paul sat very still, his hands hovering over the keys, like he was afraid to touch them. You don't want to work on the song? Paul's voice was tight, controlled, the way people sound when they're trying not to scream. John pushed off the wall. I don't want to work on any of it. I don't want to be here. I haven't wanted to be here for a long time. Paul stood up. Then why did you come? I don't know. John's voice was flat, empty. Maybe I thought I owed you something. Maybe I thought we could still pretend we're what we used to be. But we're not. We're done. George stepped forward. John, don't. John held up a hand. Don't try to fix it, George. You've been saying the same thing I'm saying for 2 years. You just didn't have the guts to say it out loud. George's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. Paul's face was red now. His hands were shaking. You don't get to just walk away. Not like this. Not after everything we built. John looked at him. Really looked at him. And for a moment, Something flickered in his eyes. Sadness, maybe. Regret. But it was gone as fast as it came. "I'm not walking away from what we built," John said quietly. "I'm walking away from what it became." Paul's breath caught. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. What it became? What it became was the most successful band in history. What it became was everything we ever dreamed of. "No," John said. "It was everything you dreamed of." The words landed like a punch. Paul stepped back, his face going pale. Ringo looked down at his lap. George turned back to the window. "You don't mean that," Paul whispered. "I do." John's voice was steady, calm, like he'd been waiting years to say it. "You wanted the fame, the tours, the albums, the legacy. You wanted to be loved by everyone. I just wanted to make music. And somewhere along the way, we stopped making music and started making a product." Paul's hands clenched into fists. "That's not fair." "Maybe not." John shrugged. "But it's true." Ringo stood up. "Guys, come on. We can't," John said, cutting him off. "We can't fix it, Ringo. We can't go back. We can't pretend we're still kids in Liverpool who just wanted to play rock and roll. That's over." "Then what do we do?" Ringo's voice cracked. "We just give up?" John didn't answer right away. He looked around the room, at the instruments, at the gold records on the wall, at the three men he'd spent a decade of his life with, men he'd laughed with, fought with, grown with, men he'd loved. "I think," John said slowly, "we let it die with dignity, before we kill each other trying to keep it alive." Paul shook his head. No, I'm not doing that. I'm not giving up on us. It's not about giving up, Paul." John's voice softened. "It's about knowing when something's finished. We had our time. We were great. We changed the world. But everything ends. Even the Beatles." Paul's eyes filled with tears. He didn't try to hide them. "I don't know how to do this without you." John's throat tightened. He swallowed hard. "You'll figure it out. You always do." There was a long silence, the kind that feels like the air is pressing down on your chest, the kind that makes you realize something important is happening, something you can't take back. George spoke, his voice low. "If you're leaving, John, I think I am too." Paul turned to him, stricken. "George." "I'm sorry, Paul." George's voice was gentle, sad. "But he's right. We're not the same anymore. And I'm tired of pretending." Ringo looked between them, his face pale. "So that's it? We're just done?" No one answered. Paul sank back down onto the piano bench. His shoulders slumped. His hands rested on the keys, but he didn't play. He just sat there, staring at nothing, like a man who just lost a war he didn't know he was fighting. John walked to the door. He stopped, his hand on the handle. He wanted to say something. Something that would make it hurt less. Something that would let them remember the good times, instead of this. But there were no words for that. No way to end something this big without breaking something inside everyone involved. So he just opened the door and walked out. The hallway was empty. His footsteps echoed on the tile. The building was quiet. The world outside was quiet. It felt like the whole planet had stopped moving, just for a moment, just to mark the end of something it didn't even know was ending. He pushed through the front door and stepped out into the London night. The air was cool. The street was wet from an earlier rain. A few cars passed, their headlights cutting through the dark. People walked by, strangers, living their lives, unaware that history had just shifted in a building they'd never been inside. John lit a cigarette. His hands were steady, but his chest felt hollow, like someone had reached inside and pulled out everything that used to fill him with joy. He thought about going back, knocking on the door, telling Paul he was sorry, telling them they could try one more time. But he didn't, because he knew it wouldn't change anything. The damage was done. The bond was broken. And some things, once broken, can't be fixed. He walked down the street, alone. Behind him, inside Abbey Road Studios, Paul McCartney sat at the piano. George Harrison stood by the window. Ringo Starr sat behind his drums. None of them moved. None of them spoke. The silence was unbearable. After a long time, Paul pressed a single key, a soft, quiet note that hung in the air like a ghost. He played another, and another. A melody. Something fragile, something beautiful, something that sounded like goodbye. George turned from the window. He watched Paul play. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were wet. Ringo stood and walked over. He put a hand on Paul's shoulder. Paul didn't look up. He just kept playing, one note at a time, a song no one would ever hear. A song that existed only in that moment, between three men who used to be four. John didn't hear it. He was already too far away, walking through the London streets, heading home, or somewhere that felt like home. He didn't know anymore. He thought about the early days, the sweat-soaked clubs in Hamburg, the tiny stages, the hours of practice, the way they'd laughed until their stomachs hurt, the way they'd believed, really believed, that music could change the world. And it had. They had changed the world. But the cost was higher than any of them expected. Fame had fed them, and then it had eaten them. Success had lifted them up, and then it had pulled them apart. Love had brought them together, and then it had been replaced by resentment, pride, and pain. John walked faster. He wanted to get away from the studio, away from the memories, away from the ghost of who he used to be. But you can't outrun yourself. The next morning, the news didn't break. There were no headlines, no announcements, just silence. The kind of silence that feels like the world holding its breath. Paul went home and wrote a song. It was called Maybe I'm Amazed, and it was about love and confusion and trying to hold on to something slipping through your fingers. George went into his garden and sat in the grass, staring at the sky, feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. Ringo called his wife and told her he didn't know what came next, but he was okay. He wasn't sure if he was lying. John went home to Yoko. She didn't ask him what happened. She just held him. And he cried. Not loud, dramatic sobs, just quiet tears that slid down his face and disappeared into her shoulder. He cried for the band, for the music, for the friendship, for the version of himself that died when he walked out that door. And then he stopped crying. And he started writing again. Because that's what artists do. They break. They bleed. They lose everything they thought mattered. And then they pick up a pen, or a guitar, or a paintbrush, and they make something new from the wreckage. In the months that followed, the world would learn what happened. The Beatles would officially break up. There would be lawsuits, anger, blame. Fans would mourn like they'd lost a family member. Critics would write essays. Historians would debate who was at fault. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the moment, the choice, the walk out the door. Because sometimes love means letting go. Sometimes strength means admitting you can't carry something anymore. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop pretending everything's fine and say out loud what everyone already knows. John Lennon walked out of Abbey Road Studios that night, and the Beatles died with his footsteps. Not because he was cruel, Not because he didn't care, but because he cared enough to stop lying. And maybe that's what courage really is. Not fighting until you win, but knowing when to walk away, even if it breaks your heart, even if it breaks everyone's heart, even if the world never forgives you. You walk anyway.